You know, and I talked about snowpack and its importance, and that's kind of my mantra is, you know, that's going to be the most difficult thing to get around right now with this drought. But this little cute guy is a poster child of a species that benefits from snow in the Sierras. This is the Pika. He's kind of half, to explain in his evolution, he's interestingly half rabbit, half elephant, believe it or not. So in his DNA, he's got high levels of both of those. So he's more of a rabbit if you kind of watch his behavior. And they certainly are cute. And they live up in these talus slopes, very high elevations, typically above the 10,000 feet elevation, higher than the timberline, in talus rocky slopes. And it's going to be like, go away. I hope that didn't do something bad. But they need these talus slopes for pretty much everything. They live in those the gaps in between the rocks. They stay there year round, they don't migrate. So they'll live in these snow fields up in these, underneath quite literally, these blankets of snow when they come down. And that snow actually is very important to them to help them thermoregulate during the winter time. So in the winter, those temperatures up here drop to well below freezing. These guys, you know, tuck themselves down in the rocks. If they don't have a nice insulative blanket of snow above them, they can actually, their core body, it becomes very difficult for them to regulate their core body temperatures to the point of not freezing to death down there. Comfortable hibernacula, or places where they hibernate during the winter, it requires having some snow overhead. What we're seeing with the snow not coming every year is that there is some movement and disappearance of populations that were there before. There's no way really to dig down into the rocks to find the little, you know, frozen or dead body down below, but what they can see is that, okay, there used to be 20 pika here, you know, 5 years ago. Now there's nothing. What's going on? And they start they've been testing with little radio transmitting thermometers that they can actually pick up temperature throughout the winter and find out what is working for them and what is not. And they're finding that the absence of snow is actually making those little denning spots inhospitable or unusable to them. But as the snow lessens, it opens up new territory for other species that don't like having the snow during the winter, especially being able to access those earlier in the spring, whereas most animals have to wait for that snow to melt before they can climb up the hills to graze the glorious pastures. Now they have instant access. They can get up there very quick and start browsing and basically competing with the pika for its food resources. So not only competing for the food resources, but it changes the composition of those food resources. So the things that they like to eat, these grasses and, you know, really delicate sedges and broadleaf plants, species compositions begins to change because the temperature is changing, the snow's not there, so it's allowing other invasive plants to take root and outcompete with those. So there's a lot of issues going on. You know, one thing to point out too is habitat doesn't go much higher than this peak up here, and as you know, temperatures rise, there's that thermocline is rising up into the Sierras. So these poor little guys literally have their backs against the sky. There's nowhere for them to run away to. So this pika is one of those species that is of very, very much concern right now, not only with the drought that's occurring now, but with climate change. And so there's a lot of fear that they're going to go extinct, and there's not much we can do about it. We can't change the weather. We can't make it snow, we can't make it rain. And we, you know, just can't, there's some things you can't do. So anyway, what can we do? Well, we can conserve water. That helps, you know, it obviously we, you know, we think about the greater impacts to agriculture and to, you know, ourselves even being able to access water our lawns and these sorts of things. But I think it's important to think beyond the impacts to ourselves and why we're conserving water, and think about wildlife and some of the other things that are being impacted by these droughts. The less water we have to pull out of the rivers, the more habitat there is going to be for fish. I mentioned before fish rescue, especially from backwater pools as water recedes. These little ponds, they kind of get stuck. They can't get back into the main channel and get away. So volunteers will go out and pick these fish up literally and move them over to the main water channel. There's also fish rescue, like I was suggesting down in San Joaquin, where they're finding these spawning salmon or the migrating salmon, and they're having to take them out of that water to cooler spot just to keep them alive before they can bring them back to the hatchery to let them breed and rear their eggs. Water cooling efforts, I mentioned like Nimbus Fish Hatchery. This is actually a photo of that site getting ready to install their cooler. This is an intake line down here coming out of the river. This is going into the hatchery facility, and they'll put their cooler in here. So they'll pull that warm water out of the river, they'll cool it, run it through the spawning area, and then discharge it back out. Again, a lot of money, a lot of effort to help protect the species, which is in decline at a very rapid rate. So trying to do what we can. Fishing closures, that's been pretty important and helpful for these same limited number of fish that are coming up. The state doesn't want people harvesting those to the point where it might be additive pressure on the already decreasing populations. And then a lot more monitoring. There's a lot of money being spent on doing fish counts, which is a pretty awesome job if you can get it, by the way. I don't know if anybody's had that experience, but I went and I volunteered and helped out and snorkel and goggles and go swim around in these creeks and literally count fish, click, 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 on the species. And it's 100 plus degrees outside and super cold in the water, at least it was at the time when I was doing it. The other changes too, even the environmental laws are being modified a little bit, state water codes being modified a little bit, really to kind of help fast track the environmental review process. And a lot of people get nervous when they say fast track environmental review, including myself. But there's a lot of care and caution, and these are beneficial projects. So the greater good is there. They may not consider air quality impacts, or they may not consider these socioeconomic impacts. Certainly they're going to be looking at biological impacts, but they want to move those through as quickly as they can to help as many of these animals out of a pretty bad situation, which is the drought right now. What's next? I think it's important that we as humans start looking more long-term in water conservation planning. It seems to be, I don't know what the term is. I heard a good little analogy about that once, but it's, every drought we get in, everybody panics. Oh yeah, okay, if it's brown, flush it down. If it's yellow, it's mellow. And we develop all these water conservation, which is great. And we do a great job. But then all of a sudden it rains again. The water's everywhere and great, flush, flush, flush. We kind of lose, when it's out of sight, out of mind. Maybe that's what I'm thinking of. We kind of lose that conservation mind. I think we're all there right now. We're doing a great job. 31% in Davis. That's awesome. I mean, that's great, but it can always be better. And I think long-term planning should include drought tolerance, water conservation. And I think we're finally seeing that, and I'm hoping as a state, even as a species, we can begin to look at water as not necessarily an unlimited resource and start to plan for it. Greater effort to slow global warming. I think there's a lot of evidence out there. I'm not sure if there's any naysayers in here that don't support the data that's out there on global warming, but there is a lot to support that it's happening. Whether or not we're causing it as a human species or if it's just a natural cycle, people will probably debate that to the end of time, which may not be very much longer, so no. So anyway, we definitely need to do more. I think there's a lot of room for improvement there globally, certainly locally. Increased monitoring of sensitive species and their habitat, so there's going to be more and more money spent towards those types of things, like the pika, for example, is getting some funding, greater sage grouse, the Amagroso vole, all these guys that are like, wow, yeah, climate change, this drought it's a perfect storm to cause these guys to, within a matter of years, their populations to dive. So they're really spending some money to watch those and help plan for them. And again, in that same kind of sentiment is spending more time and energy planning for the future that includes warmer temperatures so that we can begin to look at where to restore habitat. It may have been here, but maybe it's going to need to be a little higher in elevation if we want to preserve those species. So there's still some work to be done. With that, we had a little bit of taste of fall and some rain. It's been a long time, but I'd say pray for rain, but it might be funner to dance for rain like the Native Americans did. And, it certainly helps. We could use that water, especially up in the Sierras. Any questions? Wow, was I that thorough? No, okay.
So I have noticed while camping that the recreational fishing has decreased both in Oregon and California.
Mm-hmm.
And I heard from various sources that they were having trouble stocking lakes because of the temperature difference between the hatchery and the actual lakes.
Yeah.
The fish were getting dumped in and just dying.
Dying, shock, yeah.
Do you know anything about
So
that story?
that's part of that water cooling, those efforts, because they're doing it at the hatcheries where you would have cool water. Most hatcheries are situated below dams by necessity because it's a big barrier to fish movement up that watershed, but also cold water comes off the bottom of those dams. There's a nice cool pond of cold water down below. So they can pull that cold water that mimics what's happening in the upper reaches, and they can raise their fish in that. So when the transfer happens, there's no shock, no need. They literally will dump them out of airplanes as they're flying. The fish hit the water, and they still do it. I mean, some of them die, but hey, great, what's that? And a lot of them make it. But yes, the thermal differentiation is one of the main, the primary issue is that the water can't hold enough oxygen to help those developing embryos to finish. They're essentially suffocating, they're not getting enough oxygen. So they need the colder water that will hold more dissolved oxygen around that egg mass. So that's the primary thing. But then there's also to reduce that thermal shocking. A lot of these reservoirs are pulling warm surface water now. If any water at all, some are bone dry. But for example, Notomus on the American River, that water is all warm that's coming out of that dam now, and that's why they're needing to cool that down. And it could be a result of other hatcheries not having that capability to cool their water down, so they're not stocking as many ponds.
So are Sierra lakes getting too warm for the fish in general?
I think it's the other way around. I think right now the Sierra lakes are still maintaining temperature. They're certainly warming. There's certainly indication of that. In fact, a lot, because there's less snowmelt, you're just impounding water at that point. You're not getting that ice melt that's coming in there. But they're deep enough that where you're kind of a reverse of, if you remember I showed you that peak that was on there. So if you imagine the reverse of this peak, you take that peak, you flip it upside down, you hollow it out, fill it with water. That's kind of what those high Sierra lakes are looking at. So on this peak here, the temperatures are rising as a line slowly over time up to the top of this thing. The reverse is opposite in the lake. Actually, it's not. The cooler, that inversion of cooler water down below is, it's going to stay down there, but it starts to mix and raise over time as those water levels go down and there's not snow melt going in there. But I don't think it's at a point where they're concerned that the fish is going to boil, for example, or poach if they dump them in there. I don't think there's that differentiation. I think the primary issue is going from cold brood water into warmer surface water of the lakes up there. That could be part of the challenge.
Two following questions, I guess then. So are you aware of, or do you know about what are the non-stock native species
How many they release?
And how many, I mean, is it completely just stocked now? I mean, how many natural fish that aren't stocked are there? And sort of a related but different question is, the whole fishing, you'd think the whole fishing industry would be
throwing money at that.
and taking pretty severe action.
Yeah.
Literally, I mean, I see no people fishing in places where there were hundreds before.
The answer to your second question is that I don't know. But you could contact the Department of Fish and Wildlife and they could tell you exactly what the ratio of stocked fish to suspected wild fish. Now, wild fish is probably no longer a valid term because they've been stocking these things for so long, and there's hybridization that occurs. That like their big thing was because they're very hardy fish, are the rainbow trout, and they just stocked everything everywhere. But they stocked them in ponds that had native, like say golden trout or cutthroat trout, and then there's hybridization, and now you have this completely different thing. There's no longer any wild fish. But how many of the fish, what percentage of the fish that they release each year get caught versus remain for the following year, those are numbers they probably have estimates on. I don't think they're going out and doing fish counts for those, but they probably have some way, some metric of measuring the take, maybe by angler surveys, or they just through the years have come up with models that say, well, this percentage is going to make it and this percentage isn't. So I don't know, but you could certainly contact them to find it out. And then the second question was,
more of, it seems like the whole sport is
declining. Right.
And there are organizations that...
There are, like Trout Unlimited, there are a lot of fishing organizations, and they are spending tons of money on trying to figure out how to preserve these fish. A lot of them spend a lot of time outreaching in a negative way, but it's one of those shock and awe things. Some advocacy groups are very, very good at doing that, where they show you where they used to be. I mean, you could almost walk across rivers. There were so many salmon in there, and gigantic salmon. And so a lot of their outreach messages is, gosh, this is how it used to be, and look, now it's horrible. So they spend a lot of money there, but it grabs people's attention, and they go, yeah, why is that? And let's look at that. And their idea is to try to get more people involved in carrying that aren't fishermen. But I don't know if they're being successful there or not, because it really, for fish in particular, it's just the salmon, and those are big commercial, they're food. And so I think a lot of money goes towards those in particular because they are food and they're important to humans. As a species, as a wildlife conservationist, a fish biologist, fish conservationist, we're all interested in the species continuation, but even then, it's at a point now where there's so much intervention by humans to keep them alive that are we really doing them any good anymore, or should we just let them, kind of fail because we're having to invest all this time and money in there? There's other examples of that with other threatened and endangered species where it's literally a thread that they're hanging by, and that thread is being held by humans, and if they let go, then they're done. And so you kind of wonder, does it make sense for us to continue to do this if we know there's not going to be a viable breeding population? Things have changed so dramatically that they're just not going to be able to recover. That's a hard question. It's hard to let go of that thread. I don't know about permits, but there's been local closures. There's been a lot of creeks on watersheds, tributary creeks and stuff that have been closed to fishing. And I assume some of the lower rivers, Russian River and others, there's really strict take. Last I read, Russian River was closed to all salmon fishing, it's a really good steelhead fishery in that river. They run up there and do fairly well every year, but apparently the numbers are low enough and the water is compromised enough that they don't want any of that pressure and that mortality on the population. Mm-hmm.
I don't understand the water system, like sewage. I take gray water out of my washer and use it.
To irrigate.
And so if everyone did what I do, and I don't put garbage disposal, I don't.
You don't put food down, yeah.
But is there a certain amount of water that's necessary to go through the sewers? And like if everyone sort of
Stopped.
Yeah.
That's a really good question, and I'm sure there's a better answer than what I can give you. But I do know from just basic pollution prevention 101 that the solution to pollution is dilution. So the less water that you put down there, the more concentrated the constituents, the pollutants are going to be at the far end. Is that a complication for the treatment plant to deal and process with those? Probably, because now they have to have higher concentrations of this material, less water to treat it. But again, I think our wastewater treatment personnel, perhaps the supervisor, if you want to give me your contact information afterwards, I can get you connected with him and you can ask him that question. He'll probably tell you yes, no, maybe, we don't know. So.
And another thought is fire hydrants with all the fires that we've been having.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard that some fire hydrants didn't have any water.
Here in Davis?
No, the fires.
Oh. Yeah. That's a real possibility, especially in the more remote locations where those smaller communities are reliant on tanked water. Depending on the infrastructure and how it was designed, I mean, time and time again, you hear about this. Well, maybe not time and time again, but certainly we've heard it over the last several hundred years of colonization. For example, the city, a little ghost town of Bodie, was really booming back in the day. There, you spent all this money and time and effort putting in firefighting apparatus with a big tank up on the top of the hill. They gave it pressure, buried pipes, but they didn't have to use it after they did that for several years, and no one maintained it. So the next fire, the one that killed the town essentially, they're plugging in and everything's falling apart and water's shooting out here. In fact, there wasn't even water in the tank. No one went up to check to see that there was a hole in that tank. So I think in those instances, maybe care wasn't taken to maintain those infrastructures or protect them. Sometimes you can't protect them. If fire comes in, if it's a plastic tank, it's going to melt it. You're going to lose your water and no water pressure. Some even run their municipal water systems have to have pumps that actively pull water up, put it in the distribution system, and when the power lines get cut, they may not have backup generation systems. Again, poor planning, but that could be a cause as to why the water pressure drops to a point where nothing will come out. I'm going to go with guests first, and then we'll go.
So I have a question regarding foxtails, and I work in the veterinary field, and we see a lot of dogs come in having foxtails
Up their nose.
or
Yeah.
embedded under their skin.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, it's kind of related to the drought, but I'm not really sure if there's more foxtails as a result of the drought. I don't know if native plants are dying off and that plant is more invasive, but we've seen a lot of dogs come in.
Higher incidences.
With
Yeah.
foxtails, and I'm just curious if that's taken a large hit on.
Now, when you say foxtail, are you referencing the brome?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm
Like,
native to California,
okay.
so this was new to me this year, seeing it where I work. But it looks like a little broom, and it comes from some grassy plant weeds that grow around here, and it burrows into the animals.
It eventually works its way into the skin. Yeah.
So it can either work its way under the skin or into the nose and into the lungs.
Yeah. Yeah, those are pretty nasty old things. I don't know if anybody's been researching that. I personally have not been doing population studies to give you an answer, yes or no, with the drought. But in general, drought causes populations to decline, even native, so it can stress those to a point where they don't grow quite as vigorously. but how those plants respond to that is by producing a lot of seed, usually increasing that. They'll be shorter in stature too, which might put it closer to dog nose level. I mean, there's a lot of things that could really help to explain why the dogs are at this particular time of year or this season or the drought cycle are picking up more of them. But I think there's too many things at this point to really focus in as to give you an answer is yes, that's why it's happening. Natives tend to do okay. Native plants tend to do okay in drought. In fact, things like barley or foxtail or Avena fatua, the wild oat, which is another really kind of prickly one, they need that water, that winter water, to germinate, and they're annual, so they spring up really quick. They dump their seed and then they die. Whereas the natives are mostly perennial, and so they're like the tortoise and the rabbit thing. They just slow and go, and they will grow, and eventually they will outcompete. They'll actually literally put their branches out to shade the ground so that those annuals can't grow into there anymore. So if you remove water that those annuals are reliant on, you could actually go the other way, and there would be less of those plants produced, and you would give the natives the upper hand to kind of release a little bit. But again, the natives are thirsty too. Hopefully they're tapped down into the water, but as I kind of mentioned, water tables are dropping here and there, so that may not be the case anymore.
I couldn't help but just wonder, what happens when, a fox actually, gets rid of his foxtail?
Right, yeah. That's an interesting question from the wildlife vet med side, and then I don't know, because I'm sure they're experiencing very similar issues. I mean, I get them in my socks, and by the end of the day, I'm one of those guys that's like, I don't have time to, and I'll spend the rest of my day out in the field, and I'll get home, and the tip of that thing will have worked its way under my skin a little bit. So I know that feeling. Luckily, I can yank it out. Poor dog can't do that. Jennifer.
I was just going to comment. The lady was asking about
Oh.
conserving water and how that affects the sewer systems and stuff. But a lot of water conservation that's happening is outdoors, watering your landscape and stuff like that. So that's not going to affect the sewer systems and stuff. But yes, definitely indoors, what goes down your pipe will. So, but what most of the reductions I think that we're seeing so far is in the outdoor landscaping. As we move into the wintertime, then it's going to get a little bit more critical because we're hoping people will turn off their irrigation outside and then start to really cut back indoors. But then we start looking at, how much can the state of California has a limit that they say is necessary for health and safety.
Yeah, for like a health and safety limit, I believe it's at 55 gallons per day per person is considered kind of a health and safety level for typical indoor, water use, showering, drinking water, cooking.
How much does the drought have an effect on the aquifers, the water underneath the earth? Is there any kind of research on that in terms of how much lower they are?
Groundwater. In fact, that's a very, very important issue right now that the regional water boards are looking at, and they have sub-basin groups that are looking at their own, with quite literally basins underneath the ground, and they can measure subsidence of the surface. I mean, they know that water is being depleted at a rate that we're seeing inches of soil drop. I read somewhere that somebody came up with in the last 3 years, or maybe even the last year, the Sierra Nevadas in relation to the valley have grown like an inch. So we've subsided as a valley about an inch just from groundwater pull out. Dawn may have some additional.
A good place to get some information is the Yolo County Flood Control and Water Conservation District, very long name. But if you search for Yolo County Flood Control, they actually monitor quite a few wells throughout the county, including, they do include, I think, some information on the municipal wells.
Mm-hmm.
So you can kind of get an idea, and they've done some work with the state to do some subsidence studies.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a good place if you're just kind of interested in that info. They track water use and they look at the different well levels, and it's very cyclical in nature. The wells tend to drop quite a bit in May, and then they tend to come back up in October. And so we're already, the last Water Resource Association meeting I was at, they were saying that they've already seen the water levels start to come back up in those groundwater wells. But there is an inelastic and elastic portion is what's been explained to me. when it comes to subsidence, there's this elastic, kind of a curve that happens every year. So, drop in May, kind of gradually come back up. But it has been a very small inelastic loss in the Yolo County area, much smaller than, San Joaquin or other places within the valley, but there has been an amount that will never recover.
Or take a very, very long time to recover. I didn't, and that's actually an interesting topic. I didn't include much of that in here just because of the relationship with wildlife. Not too many wildlife, to my knowledge, utilize the groundwater, with the exception of the shallow, hard pan groundwaters like you see out in the desert and those little riparian systems. And those certainly are reliant on water moving through the ground to recharge those. But I also know, that it's, we've relied on the Sierra Nevada snowpack, and now that that's kind of gone, we're relying more and more on groundwater, so it's becoming more of a concern. The recent permit application for ground wells at the state level has tripled this year. So the number of wells that's going in essentially has tripled. So farmers are scratching their head looking at their dry and dusty ag land saying, I have no way to irrigate this, I'm gonna sink a hole here. They go down 300 or 400 feet, find no water, go down 1,000 feet to the really low stuff and start tapping in there. And the challenge there is that, the deeper you go, the more time it takes to recharge. So you're digging deep into your savings account at that point, or our savings account at that point. It takes millennia for that groundwater to recharge.
I believe last year in Yolo County there were, I'm not sure if I've got the most updated number, but I think there were 13 new well permits that were pulled last year.
Just in Yolo?
Pretty substantial increase just for the county.
Yes.
I saw in the paper description of a native plant society meeting that was going to take place for a whole day. Do you know anything about that?
Was it using drought tolerant landscaping?
Yeah.
Was it the California Native Grasslands Association?
Yeah, that might have been it.
Okay.
It already was?
There's a workshop in Sacramento, I think, that's either happened or coming up very soon.
There's one on October 29th, I think that's 8 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon.
Yeah, that was what it sounded like.
Yeah, and that's probably what it is. I don't remember off the top of my head the details on it, but if you take my card, I can get it to you because I'm planning on attending.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Good.
You could also Google California Native Grasslands
Well,
Association.
I didn't really know what it was.
I couldn't remember the name of the agency.
Non-native
Yeah.
grasslands.
All right. Because native grasses are actually a great substitute for non-native grasses. That's strange. How does that work? But they do quite well. They brown during the summertime, sure, but they stay a little bit green. And you can actually just give them once a summer during the heat of summer, a real low soak, slow soak. And that's it. The rest of the year, they're going to rely on rainwater that comes down. And some of the species, even like purple needlegrass, for example, their roots are literally go down 6 feet, and they can start accessing some of the moisture down below, which is nice. And if you have those in association with trees, especially native trees, then there's a benefit to the grass because of the tree's roots. The trees will hold moisture or pull moisture up, and then the grasses can access that. There's a happy relationship there. So.
Well, years ago, we planted coyote bush in our front garden.
How did that experiment turn out?
It's-
It's all over the place, right?
Well, no, that's true.
Yeah. It's a great plant. No, don't get me wrong, I love it, but it can be invasive in its own right.
Yeah, well, it just has the whole garden.
Yeah.
There's nothing else there.
Yeah. Which can be nice, the birds love it. Actually, that's one of the few, it might be
Giant silk moth.
one of two. The silk moth utilizes that?
Giant silk moth that's this big.
Yeah.
That's what it eats.
Yeah.
Period.
But that's actually something I had no idea. That's pretty cool. I'm gonna have to look that up. But what I was gonna say is that's one, I think, two native plants, California native plants that flower during the wintertime. Everything else during the spring, summer, but they wait until it's winter and then have a whole host of, little insects hanging around them to help them out. And then that becomes a bird buffet. So you get the insectivorous birds that are coming in, and they'll glean. I'm sure you've seen it in the winter times. You get a lot of warblers and
And, you know, it has a really nice fragrance, actually.
yeah, it's kind of pleasant. So do you see the moths in town or?
No, I was in the Placerville area,
Mhm.
and I forget, somehow a giant silk moth found its way into my life.
Mhm.
And I researched it, and I found that it was coyote bush that it eats, and I had it on my property, so I went and harvested it, and I got a cycle.
So they started laying the eggs. Oh, cool.
But I didn't notice it because I had put some sort of a black landscape cloth, and the eggs are black.
Mm.
And I didn't see them at first, and then, wow.
Yeah, there they were.
And then I got another generation, but I had a huge terrarium.
How cool.
But the second generation was half the size. So
Oh, interesting.
I wasn't feeding it as well
Yeah.
as it needed to feed. But there were very few bushes on the property, so.
You created the pygmy silk moth.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't manage to I put it out after that. I thought, I'm not doing this creature any favors.
No. Oh, that's cool. Thank you all for coming.